Hello everyone. On behalf of the Centre for Fiction, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's event celebrating the launch of Granta's new issue dedicated to new Irish writing. It's a wonderfully rich, thick, capacious volume full of treasures. As you've heard, my name is Clair Wills. I write about Irish literature and history, and I teach at Princeton. We're going to start this evening with short readings from each of the writers who are here today. We haven't got the whole roster, I'm afraid. And you'll be pleased to know that even though it is the Centre for Fiction, we are going to hear some poetry. I'm just going to introduce the readers and writers, the writers who will be reading all together, and then we'll hear from them. So the first one is Belinda McKeon. She's the prize-winning author of Solace, published in 2011, a piercing novel she followed up with Tender, published last year. Belinda lives in New York and she teaches at Rutgers. Then we'll hear from Mary O'Donoghue, poet and a novelist, who teaches at Babson College in Massachusetts, but she lives in Alabama. She's going to perhaps explain how she manages that. She has two wonderful volumes of poetry, Tull, published in 2001, and Among These Winters, published in 2007. And she followed that up with a highly acclaimed novel, Before the House Burns, in 2010. She's also a translator of Irish language poetry, and that's possibly something that we'll talk about later. Next up, we'll have Stephen Sexton, a Belfast poet whose pamphlet Oils was the UK Poetry Book Society's 2014 pamphlet choice. And he's also published in a number of magazines and journals, for example, Poetry Ireland Review. Then Sally Rooney, a Dublin-based writer whose short stories have been published in The Stinging Fly, Dublin Review, and Winter Pages. She's currently working on her first novel. And finally, Colm Tóibín, whose most recent novel, Nora Webster, joins Brooklyn and The Master as one of a number of stories which offer intense and convincing portraits of individuals exploring the contours of their own often constricted lives. In addition to his 8 novels, Colm has published 2 volumes of short stories and several plays, including most recently The Testament of Mary. He teaches at Columbia. So without more ado, we'll start. Thank you. Just be careful. Made it.
Hi everybody, it's lovely to be here. Thanks so much to Granta for bringing us here into the Centre for Fiction, for hosting, and I'm delighted to be reading with my fellow Irish writers. So I'm going to read a very short excerpt from the short story I contributed to this issue, which is called Party Party. And it's about, that's the first time I've said that title out loud. It's the cadence I'm on. It's about a number of people who are living together in a house in Dublin for reasons that are not known. They've been in this house for a while, and now it's time to welcome people in for, well, a housewarming of sorts, but a party certainly. In the morning, the cleaners arrived. 2 local women, one close to 70, the fine bones of her face holding out against her ruin, the other younger, flint-eyed, her lips a sour twisting. Kate opened the door to them, and Jerry stepped forward to give them their instructions, brisk and accusatory as Jerry always knew how to be. She made it sound as though these women had themselves been the one to dirty the bathrooms, to scatter the papers, to leave the egg rotting in the shelves of the fridge door. They scowled, tying on their aprons and laying out their detergents. They knew well how to charge, but they would earn every cent of it. Jerry would make sure of that. We went back to what we had been doing. John took up his newspaper, underlining names, making notes in the margins. Kate got Ash, the child, ready for her trip to the woman's house. where she would spend the night. The woman has a name, of course, but for a long time now we have simply been calling her the woman. And it works, we always know who we mean. Ash is 6 and the daughter of this house. She was, of course, the daughter of only one of us to begin with, but we don't believe in such distinctions anymore. She had no interest in the party. She let Kate pack up her little rucksack and she headed with no questions, with no drawn-out goodbyes, for the door. Laura did another check on the gift bags, making sure each one contained what it needed, the wisdom stone and the iodine pill and the specially commissioned book of poems. These days, to celebrate anything, you needed poems. That said, the specially commissioned poets were not actually really poets. They had not actually really been commissioned. They were not actually really people at all, but the inventions of Laura and John, who had written all of the poems in one night, letting wine and gin and whiskey hammer the lines onto their laptop screens. They had piled up a dozen or so books as templates, but they abandoned them after the 10th poem, or the 12th. By then they realized it was just word, 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 image, 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 and a line break here and a triple indent there. Coming, going, trying, proud, they called it. And on the back they put a blurb from a real poet, a poet whose name even the party guests would recognize, praising this volume of the youngest, freshest voices in Irish poetry, this bringing together of talents from all backgrounds, all ethnicities. Ash Editions, we called ourselves as publishers. It was a sweet touch, yes. We were ready. We'd been living in this damn house for years, and bearing it, enduring it, piecing it into its proper shape, one floor, one room, one skirting board and light switch in length of copper piping at a time. We had not pulverized one another with copper piping over the course of that period. That was an accomplishment. Or maybe that was a miracle. And we believed in miracles. We believed in the grace and the beauty of what had been taught to us, about what we deserved and were entitled to have. We were blessed. That was the truth of it. We used that word without irony. We used that word without fear.
Coming, going, trying.
Proud.
I never feel proud, but I like coming.
That's why we didn't put you in the book of poems.
Trying. Thank you so much for hosting us this evening. My thanks to Granta and also to Claire, our wonderful moderator. I'll read a short piece from my story, Kiddio at the Wedding, just to tell you a little bit about that story. It is a story about a refugee. In this case, he is in the south with all of its beautyberry, its nearby tornadoes, its mosquitoes. But as a story about a war child, it could also be set, I suppose and I hope, in any number of places. I'll read a few sections from the beginning. Kiddio was between shoe sizes when we went to my cousin's wedding in a superannuated church that smelled of cooked dust. All day he tottered like a sandpiper to cope with his Puma sneakers constriction. Before we lit out for the journey, he walloped my hand away when I tried to slacken his laces, and the sharp report rustled up tears. They brimmed so quickly I had to tilt my head far back. Not for the pain, no. I was thinking how much more drastic all this would be without him. For he had stood on a chair and zipped my dress to where it needed to be, and touched my hair, which there was no call for at all. I let him spritz gardenia in my elbow crooks and behind my ears. Soon we were all set. It was August then, and so hushed and morning, it was hard to believe the tree crickets had played saws for hours last night. We were only together, he and I, because I had ducked into the church for a pee back in June. It was the longest day of the year, and everything crept like molasses. The church was the biggest in town, with a back end as dour as a storage facility, and the frontage made beautiful by Rose of Sharon and a string of genial gargoyles. I hadn't been inside since I don't know how long. Beeswaxed corridors and a poster from Isaiah, "Behold, I am doing a new thing." I wondered that the prophet didn't trim to a goatee and sign up for OkCupid. When I walked back up the stairs, 25 or so people had materialized against the lobby wainscoting. Their heads were slung low and they looked woebegone, especially the older in their number. There were intimations of beautiful bones and good looks in the younger ones. The overall picture gripped me, the collective sang-froid, the clothes all cut from the same rain cloud. I didn't see the 2 or 3 kids beaded among them. Then, from the cockpits of Nissans and Subarus came the wives of southern burghers, bringers of food on oblong plastic platters. They unfolded tables and snapped out plastic floral tablecloths. They billowed thermal waves of kindness and solicitude. My mother had been one of their reservists until she deserted in favour of the Northeast. Some of them knew me from old. We regarded one another with the truculence of friends who had gone on to better things and just didn't want reminding of those ungainly days. They asked after my mother's welfare. I said she was much better, thanks, after a bout of mid-epigastric discomfort. Her words, not mine, I told them, and I syllabized the thing out. Mid-epi, you get the rest. They asked me to relay their good wishes and prayers. They said just how lovely it was. I moved back to town after all this time. I was weakened in the blast of tuber rose and goodwill, and it etherized me enough to stick around and help lay the tables. Their ringleader said the group standing against the wainscoting were misfortunate people from the very worst place on earth. They were being prepared for international friendship alliances while their refugee status was being ratified, and perhaps I would give some consideration to being an international friend. And I said yes, not glibly so as to get out the door, nor was it dazzlement from the good deeds flaring around me like Friday night lights. I said yes because I was asked. Their ringleader smiled so approvingly, I felt bashful and delighted and confused, all in one hot mess. She said I could continue to help with dispersing shoes and clothes. Thank you.
Yeah, I got the alphabet wrong. I understand it's not before R, but I'm sorry about that.
I'm happy to represent S in the alphabet slightly sooner than you anticipated. Thank you so much to Granta and to everyone for letting me be here. It's a pleasure to be in your fine city, and I'm having a great time. This is a poem, I guess, about a tragedy of some sort that happens in a tiny village, very similar to the one that I grew up in. I guess how an incident or an accident spreads out within a small community. The butcher. It is the coldest noon in 20 years. Outside, deer are nowhere to be seen, and inside, the radio spectrum fills up with sorrowful little packets of data. Wasn't there a heart at the window yesterday, he thinks? Weren't there huge antlers? What is there to be said of the unanswerable phone ringing as it's been ringing lately? And of the village blue with snow, the flaked almonds of snow. And there on the fold-out table, folded out for once, the bowl of raisins she has eaten none of, for fear of unsettling her veil, today of all todays. and dawn coming so late last night it resembled mercy, until at last it came, resembling cruelty. And what is there to be said of all the hands and wrists and forearms and the men shaking them and their regrets into his palms like hucksters shilling counterfeits, and over whiskey nodding stories of times they were right and other men were wrong, and how the pub was closed for an hour as a mark of respect, and chimney smoke over the village as though it was coffee cooling. What is there to do with the sick pigeon sanctuaried against the woodpile the beech tree was, before the lightning brought it down, which he claimed with his beech-handled axe before the rest of town got wind of it, which he and the boy tramped back to the house with that last time? And what can be left to say about the snow globe in which all of this happens, without taking away from the butcher, who must get to work, grief or no grief, if his neighbours are to eat, who must begin his work of opening up the way he will the newspaper. The coldest winter in 20 years goes the headline, and somewhere under the canopy of the woods go deer shattering themselves against one another with an architecture of golden blood and a rage they can't express.
Hi, I'd also like to join the thanks to Granta for having me here and to the Centre for Fiction also. It's lovely to be here with you all tonight, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to read a little from the story that appears in the issue. I'm not going to start at the very beginning, so what you've missed is that our protagonist Suki has just landed in Dublin Airport after a journey from Boston, and that's where we catch up with her. I hadn't been planning to come back to Dublin for Christmas, but my father Frank was being treated for leukemia at the time. My mother had died from complications after my birth, and Frank had never remarried, so legally speaking, he was my only real family. As I explained in my Happy Holidays email to my new classmates in Boston, he was going to die now too. Frank had problems with prescription drugs. During childhood, I had frequently been left in the care of his friends, who gave me either no affection, or else so much that I recoiled and scrunched up like a porcupine. We lived in the Midlands, and when I moved to Dublin for university, Frank liked to call me up and talk to me about my late mother, who he informed me was no saint. Then he would ask if he could borrow some money. In my second year of college, we ran out of savings, and I could no longer pay rent, so my mother's family cast around for someone I could live with until my exams were over. Nathan's older sister was married to an uncle of mine. That's how I ended up moving in with him. I was 19 then. He was 34. And lived alone, and had a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment where he lived alone with a granite-topped kitchen island. At the time, he worked for a startup that developed behavioural software, which had something to do with feelings and consumer responsiveness. Nathan told me he only had to make people feel things. Making them buy things came later on in the process. At some point, the company had been bought out by Google, and now they all made hilarious salaries and worked in a building with expensive hand dryers in the bathroom. Nathan was very relaxed about me moving in with him. He didn't make it weird. He was clean but not prudish, and a good cook. We developed interests in each other's lives. I took sides when factional disputes arose in his office, and he bought me things I admired in shop windows. I was only supposed to stay until I finished my exams that summer, but I ended up living there for nearly 3 years. My college friends worshipped Nathan and couldn't understand why he spent so much money on me. I think I did understand, but I couldn't explain it. His own friends seemed to assume there was some kind of sordid arrangement involved, because when he left the room, they made certain remarks toward me. "They think you're paying me for something," I told him. That made Nathan laugh. "I'm not really getting my money's worth, am I?" he said. "You don't even do your own fucking laundry." At the weekend, we watched Twin Peaks and smoked weed together in his living room, and when it got late, he ordered in more food than either of us could possibly eat. One night, he told me he could remember my christening. He said they served a cake with a little baby made out of icing on top. "A cute baby," he told me. "Cuter than me?" I said. "Yeah, well, you weren't that cute." It was Nathan who paid for my flight home from Boston that Christmas. All I had to do was ask. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody. This is, I better find it here. I had the page open and then I closed it. I just found it again. This is a novel that I'm working on. I sort of know the rest of it if anyone could finish it for me. Over drinks maybe, I'll tell you the story. But once more, anyway, this is set in contemporary Germany, in Berlin, and Heinrich is really fed up with his father, who's a philosopher. He's even more fed up now because his father is dying and he's on morphine in a hospice. And his father has one last wish, which Heinrich knows is going to be trouble. It's always been trouble, and now his one last wish is to go to the zoo, be accompanied by the nurse in the hospice, by Heinrich, and by Heinrich's wife Lisa, who of course has bonded with Heinrich's father in a way that's really, really profoundly irritated Heinrich, who's very easy to irritate, but he really is being irritated. And anyway, as the father is moving around in, this is Berlin Zoo, he comments on, as though he's beginning to write a new book, as though there's something, as though he's about to embark on a serious new tome of philosophy. So Heinrich says to him, like, what do you want to see? And he says, Father, this is the father, he's in the wheelchair, he's already seen lines, he's already seen various other things. Fish. The fish that cling to the bottom, the primitive beginning of things, organisms that are easily satisfied, the ones that keep out of trouble. I wonder if keeping out of trouble is not the real thing. Maybe that is what thinking is, or should be, a way of keeping out of trouble. Maybe we could learn from fish, the ones that don't get eaten, that is. I mean, the main thing, I suppose, is not to get eaten, at least when you're alive. Yes, not to get eaten. As they moved down the gallery, they stopped when they came to the chameleons. The two chameleons in a glass case appeared to interest all of them, Heinrich thought, because of their beauty and their stillness. They looked like a pale painting. It would not matter to the chameleons, Heinrich felt, if they faded away. They could easily merge with things. Unlike humans, he thought, whose ungainly bodies had to be burned or buried in the earth and who had property to be disposed of, clothes to throw out, ideas. His father seemed transfixed by the chameleons and put up his hand, demanding silence when he thought that someone was going to speak. He signalled to Heinrich to come close, and when he did, he signalled to him further to remain still and watch. There was a small insect, like a cockroach, moving slowly along a branch within the glass case where the two chameleons were. It had eyes and a mouth that could be clearly seen. The chameleon on the closest branch was classically gazing at it in a pose of unconcern. Nothing happened as the insect moved slowly forward. It was blindly approaching the chameleon. The insect's main effort, it appeared, was not to fall over. It was difficult to imagine, Heinrich thought, where it presumed it was going or why. Suddenly, without moving or making any obvious effort, the chameleon put out its long tongue and rolled the insect into its mouth. A mouth too small to take in the captured object in one gulp, so that for a few moments minuscule wriggling legs or tentacles stuck out of the chameleon's mouth. And then the insect was gone. It was as if it had never been. Perhaps Heinrich thought it had left little insects with its own genetic code wandering in some other part of the zoo or freely on the earth. But otherwise there was no sign anywhere that there had once been an insect, this particular insect. His father nodded his head, not exactly in approval of what he had witnessed, but in seeming confirmation of what he had suspected all along. And then he signalled that they should move on. When they arrived at the jellyfish, Heinrich's father reached into an inner pocket and took out his reading glasses and put them on. With his finger in the air, he began to follow the wavering movements of a tiny jellyfish in the water on the other side of the glass, or what appeared to Heinrich more like particles of a jellyfish or an embryo or a section of an embryo. All four of them watched as the tiny jellyfish resisted and then accepted the current of the water in the tank. It was more like a parachute than a fish, Heinrich thought, and its colour was closer to no colour at all than blue or pink, even though there were traces of blue and pink in the bell-shaped film above, a small amount of matter that pulsed as it floated. Pulse, heart, vagina, his father said in a loud, authoritative voice. He indicated then that he wanted to go. The nurse assented and lifted the brake on the wheelchair. Lisa, Heinrich's wife, walked ahead, checking regularly that the old man had been satisfied with his visit to the aquarium, while the nurse, who had not spoken once but had remained competent, gentle and fully in control, pushed the wheelchair. Heinrich walked behind, feeling a strange new sadness about his father and his sudden mania for looking at these abject creatures in captivity and making statements about them, statements that sounded as if they were making sly fun of all his life's work. Heinrich silently repeated the words, pulse, heart, and vagina. But they were his father's words, and they must have been of some use to his father. Perhaps he had spoken them out loud to keep other, more menacing or terrifying words out of his mind. But they were of no use to Heinrich now. His father and he and Lisa and the nurse made their way back in the taxi through the Berlin traffic to the hospice. Before, such words might have made him laugh, but the time for laughter, it struck him, was, at least for the moment, suspended. Thank you.
It is, of course, begging the question to try and have a conversation about a national literary scene and what feels like an increasingly internationalised, globalised moment. Much of the work in this lovely collection it is about Ireland. Apart from what we've heard here, there's Kevin Barry's lovely memoir of Cork. Roddy Doyle has a story about boys taking the Intercert. Lucy Caldwell has a story of schoolgirl love in Belfast. But much of it is not about Ireland at all, or it's only tangentially about Ireland. Three of the writers sitting on the podium here live and work for much of the time in the United States. And the idea of Ireland's relationship to other places is deeply etched throughout this collection. Sally's story, for example, as she mentioned, begins after a flight from Boston to Dublin, and that distance partly determines the way that the story unfolds. Now, I think we're not going to get into trying to think about what's Irish about Irish writing, because that takes us into dangerous territory, and instead I'd like to begin by thinking a little bit about distances. Mary, if I could start with you. Your story, as you explained, is set in the American South. You come from rural County Clare, and you said that in many ways that was a very fixed place. The narrator of your story, somewhere in Alabama, I'm assuming, strikes up a friendship with a refugee boy, so someone from yet somewhere else, from the very worst place on earth. You said that you wanted to use the small details of her relationship with this refugee boy to try to get what we call the sprawl, the distances of the United States, and perhaps the different distances between the United States and further afield. Does that have to do with coming from a very fixed place?
Can you hear me? Thank you for that question, Claire. You've just complicated things once again for me, in a good way. I will never, none of us will, be able to contain the sprawl, the beautiful sprawl, the difficult sprawl that is America. At the same time, I feel completely incapacitated to reach back into Ireland to kind of access those details. I'm helped, I think, in this. And I'm going to invoke Colm McKeon here, whom I know many of you hold dear and read with great interest. And he calls on John Berger to help explain this difficulty, I think, of wanting access to details as some kind of assistance in bridging distance. And he says that somebody asked John Berger one time, well, where are you from, really? I can't even remember where John Berger is from. Don't tell me, because then I'll just ruin things. And Berger said that he thought of himself as a patriot of elsewhere. And I really love this description as a way to live in a place that is not one's own, a place that is not as fixed as the Burren in County Clare, which, you know, is impossible to disintegrate based on the amount of mega anims or Anna that has been around. but I guess I'm trying to sort of break into new places through language to try and understand a place with some kind of generosity, but also with complete curiosity. I love places that are not mine. I love places that are my elsewheres, and I find myself in one of those right now. If that somehow.
That's really helpful. And Sally, can I bring you in? Thinking about distance.
Sure.
So you begin your story with a girl or a young woman turning up from the plane, on the plane in Dublin. To what extent, I mean, why did that need to happen? Why is the distance important?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think I should probably say I'm not necessarily the best reader of my own work, so I don't always know why things happen the way they do or work the way they do. I think I probably used distance in a very mechanical way to create the driving tension of the story, which is sort of that Suki, the protagonist, is far away from these sort of the unfolding crisis of her life is happening in Dublin, and she's located in Boston, and then she kind of comes home and has to geographically and personally confront what's going on. So I think that's probably how the distance works. It creates what is the essential sort of conflict of that story, and it drives it. I'm not sure that I was conscious of touching on any themes beyond the necessary nuts and bolts of making a story work and giving it a plot. But I'm sure I was drawing on all kinds of things I wasn't aware of.
Mm-hmm. And Colm, your story is set in Berlin. It's about a lot of things. It's about the relationship between a novelist or a writer's son and his philosopher father. It's about different ways of understanding experience, a battle between philosophy and fiction. And there's also, I think, a wonderful tension between something that looks like it's a realist story, and it is real. They do go to the zoo, but it's also completely surreal what seems to happen in the zoo. But then again, it's set in Berlin, and Germany seems to be important. It's not just any old place. The philosopher father knows Angela Merkel, for example, and that's mentioned several times. The kind of aura of European politics doesn't seem to be an addition. It seems to be part of what you're wanting to talk about. So what is going on there?
Well, I just got really tired of myself. I'd written, Brooklyn and Nora Webster, which really are set in an Enniscorthy of the older generation of my aunts, of my parents, and the Testament of Mary, which is set in my religion, which is Catholicism. I just thought it'd be really great to become sort of Lutheran, and it'd be great also to just not to have any mention of our little republic, our funny little island, our strange little floating place. That oddly enough is Ireland is, I'm not sure I know anything about Ireland because I'm from Wexford, and I see Wexford as being a different sort of place than, say, Wicklow. I don't like Wicklow, or Carlow. I don't like Carlow, or Waterford. I don't like Waterford. They're the kinds around Wexford, and I don't feel when I'm going through them that they have anything to do with me, and I would stop if I could help it. And but it was also written in a time when we were being emphatically and deliberately and publicly controlled by Germany. Mm-hmm. And I became interested in the idea of what someone of my age would be like if he were German. Mm-hmm. And the extraordinary ways in which Germany has become this great democracy, this place with the first time I came across, I'll stop in a second, the first time I came across this great democracy was when Gunter Grass was openly and absolutely opposed to reunification, and the German government paid for him to tour the world to oppose the German government, openly in New York, in Dublin, anywhere he would go. They said, "We will send you to oppose us, because that's what an open society is like." And I'm interested in the way Germany has developed, and I've been following. So I thought it was about time that I stopped writing about Enniscorthy and just became somebody else for a change. I mean, I'll go back eventually. That happened.
Only to Enniscorthy, though, not to Carlow.
No, I go. There's about a 10-mile journey to the coast, especially the coast that I like as well.
One of the ways in which Irish historians have characterised the history of 20th century Ireland is that time went extra slow for a really large part of the mid-century. Politically and economically, and in terms of liberal conceptions of human rights, the country was kind of caught in a time war. And then in the 1990s, time suddenly speeded up as history caught up with itself, social liberalisation, the peace process, and perhaps less positively, the Celtic Tiger years and the follow-on from that, the sudden collapse of prosperity with the economic crash. Now, I accept that novelists and poets are not historians, except that I think they really are. But I do notice that many of the pieces in this collection are about generational shifts, and in that sense they are partly about a way of telling history. The mixture of love, impatience and rage we feel for parents and the desire to make new communities with children keeps cropping up in story after story. And that familial tension is very often figured as a relationship between a rural past, a past which is very recent, just one generation back or even still present, and a comparison between that and an everyday life in the city or in an urban environment. And it's not just, I think, a relationship of past to present, but it's geographical. There's a sense of rural Ireland as ever present. I mean, and even not necessarily rural Ireland, you know, the scrubby bits of land at the edge of the town kind of enter into the town. I'm thinking of, there's a lovely piece by Colm Barrett in the collection. He always gives us kind of estates perched just on the edge of something else. Stephen, I wonder if I could bring you in here. You read your poem, The Butcher, which you described as about a kind of a village that you came from. What's interesting to me in the poem is that it may or may not be a real place. It may or may not be, a place inside a snow globe. And many of your poems work with these kinds of shifts in perspective, as though you're trying to get the right distance to see the nature of a place or a moment. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about coming from a rural place and living in the city in this context.
It is sort of, when I think about where that poem's located, it's located sort of in a version of the small village that I grew up in. I live in Belfast, in the north of Ireland, which is by no means a big city, but it's a city by comparison. And it's that cliche about recognising where it was that you lived once you no longer live there, and that poem's, I guess, what am I not? Pardon me. Just a little more audible. Thanks. So there's one thing that I guess I became interested in is images of things, and how I didn't really ever get over like Rennie Magritte. I didn't get over it not being a pipe. That blew my mind. And I guess when I don't know what that poem's about, but I invoked like a snow globe at some point, and I guess what I was thinking of is in terms of a tragedy or a traumatic event or something, one might say there's people are inclined to to make a copy of it or something, or to recognize or to make a little bubble of that tragedy, to disconnect it from the world at large, or perhaps they don't make that decision, but they're in it anyway, or they're whatever this event is, it causes this bubble, or a snow globe, I guess is what I described it as, and something about how writing about an event such as a tragedy, it is to make an image of it, and to some extent is to delineate it, is to neutralize it almost, I guess. But yeah, it's neutralizing this small village, and sort of making myself be done with thinking about this aspect of it.
And Belinda, could I bring you in here on the relationship between rural and urban, maybe, because in both Solace and in Tender, you have central characters who look back one generation, or have to go home actually, to a rural Ireland that they're not sure what they feel about it. And well, I'm very interested that the story that you have here in this collection is rather different, but perhaps I'd ask you just first of all to comment on the rural-urban as a kind of generational shift.
Well,
Yeah, I suppose because I grew up in rural Ireland, the reason I wrote 2 novels which are looking back to the rural is because it's so much part of my own sensibility. But I also don't really hold with that idea that the rural and the urban plug into that generational divide, or I think there's a difference between the tradition, the Irish tradition, may be very steeped in an idea of the rural novel, but I don't think that the past and the rural equate at all. I mean, as you said a couple of minutes ago, the rural is all around us in Ireland, and I think that it's about the local, really. That all fiction isn't even the fiction of New York is local in many ways. So it's not something, for me, it's not something conscious. I think it comes out of my own experience in one way, but also in both of those novels, I just wanted to write about what people's lives were like, and partly because Ireland is such a small country. That those lives involved inevitably moving between the rural and the urban fairly seamlessly, and finding elements of each other in each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the story in Granta, I don't write a lot of short stories, and I noticed that all of the short stories that I wrote in the last couple of years were about emigrants returning to Ireland from New York. And I just thought, this is just getting a bit of, that's enough of that. And I wanted to do something. I wanted to disallow myself, to sort of use that muscle that was so familiar. I think I'm probably not done with that just yet.
All right.
But
you make a very brave choice in I think it really works, but it's a very brave choice to write the whole thing in the second person plural. It's all we. And I kept thinking when I was reading it that we're going to shift out of we and move into I, but we don't. And I think it's really interesting as a kind of exploration of a nature of a community. One of the things that happens in the story is they keep waiting for this bloke Arlo to turn up, and he doesn't turn up. I shouldn't have told you that. Sorry. Or does he turn up? But I wonder, it reads as though it must partly be an allegory, and it must partly possibly be thinking about a Beckettian allegory with Arlo as Godot. But what is it an allegory of?
Well, it is an allegory. It's sort of, I planned it so that in April, when it was published, a story called Party, Ireland would consist of 2 parties fighting for 9 weeks over how and whether to bother forming a government at all. Right? It was just really good timing. So that's what's been happening in Ireland. During the whole celebration of the 1916 centenary, we effectively have had no government, just 2 parties who have been fighting and bickering like children at a birthday party. That's my way of it is an allegory, but I tried not to think too much about what I was trying to allegorize, except that I knew there was, I don't think of it as a community so much as a sect, and I think that's why I went for the communal voice. It originally was going to be about a couple having a party, having a housewarming party, and it morphed it over the months I was working on it into something completely different. But the first line, which was there were a lot of regrets but we didn't care, that had always been there, and then the story changed over the course of time that I was working on it. And then Arlo was going to come, and he came in different drafts, and then he didn't come, and I worked out, obviously somewhere along the way I thought, well, this is just, this is going, it's Godot, it has, I have to change that, because you can't do that. And then I thought, well, it's so obvious, I think I'm just going to leave it there and not worry about it and try and write the story anyway.
It's certainly a kind of disturbing portrait of politics, or of the power of influence, perhaps. And I suppose I'd like maybe to try and turn the conversation to thinking about Ireland over the last 8 years and the period of intense economic fragility in Ireland and also the rest of Europe more generally, and ask about the extent to which your own experience, particularly I suppose for the people living in Ireland, that economic fragility has fed into cultural fragility, or perhaps its opposite, has kind of fed a kind of stronger cultural activity. I was recently reading a wonderful new anthology of Greek poetry the editor, Karen Van Dyke, points out that in Greece now, generally, there's less of everything. Food, electricity, everything, except for two things. There are more refugees and there's more poetry. Poetry is kind of everywhere. Reading in public squares, graffiti, poetry slams, poets blogging and posting, and I guess the same, it's a poetry anthology, so she's not talking about short fiction, but I guess the same is true of fiction as well. I accept that Greece and Southern Europe in general has suffered extremes of austerity, which are considerably more than Ireland, but I still wonder about the material aspects of culture generation in Ireland. When people ask why there's so much good Irish writing about, part of the answer must be there's a huge amount of talent, but another part of the answer must be that there are forums and ways of supporting Irish writing. And I suppose I'd like to get your sense of, or I'd like us to explore the extent to which those are institutionally structured, or is it down the pub? Is it kind of unofficial kinds of support? What has been your experience? Sally, can I ask you to start on that?
Sure. My experience has been all fairly recent. I was still in school when the recession happened, so I kind of grew up during the Celtic Tiger, and by the time I graduated from university, the recession was, it was austerity government, and that's been my whole adult life in Ireland. In terms of the literary scene, I think there is an extent to which you can say cultural dialogue is energised by periods of crisis. That probably is true. But I don't want to say that in a way that makes it sound like I'm grateful for this horrible economic collapse that destroyed people's lives, because good books came out of it. But I think there probably is a merit to... I think maybe during the period of the Celtic Tiger there was a reluctance to question sort of the enormous appearance of prosperity and what seemed to be a very smooth functioning of capitalism. And then when cracks appear in that, maybe it does energise a kind of dialogue. In terms of whether or not the Dublin literary scene revolves around the pub, I can confirm that to an extent it does. Yeah, there is a lot. I think Dublin is a kind of a size of a city where communities can grow quite organically. It's kind of small enough that you can get to know people face to face, and there are a lot of book launches and stuff where you can kind of meet people. I wonder if that makes it sound really cliquey, and then I don't know if it is or not. But there are a number of really great journals in Dublin that are very open to receiving open submissions from people they've never heard of and printing work from really young writers. So the Stinging Fly.
And the publication of those does seem to have increased in the last few years, despite the fact that there's less money.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Stephen, can you compare your experience in Belfast on this?
Yeah, I would say first of all that it's approximately 1950 in Northern Ireland. So in the future I'll let you know how it's going. But as far as that's just basic human rights and stuff. But as far as publications and available journals go, there was a period where there was a lot more of them. I think that's shut down. A lot of them have been hit. Arts Council funding has been hit, I think, in the UK and Ireland quite significantly. What that has led to, I guess, is is a lot of people just simply doing things for free, doing them on a sort of community basis. My experience, though, I guess, has been that I'm a student at a university. I'm at Queen's University in Belfast. I'm on a creative writing PhD program. And so my experience has always been sort of quite closely bound to the university, which has its problems, or at least there are a lot of perceptions of problems. I guess there's been a lot of discussion about MFA programs in general and the sort of work that they churn out, I guess is the phrase that's often used, that it's of a similar standard, that it's unchallenging, that it's perfect, but so what? There's it's just maybe disinteresting. But nevertheless, in Belfast anyway, there is a huge community of people writing. As a friend of mine would say, it seems in Belfast you can't spit without hitting a poet, and a lot of the time that's maybe true. It seems that there's there are events constantly, there's poetry constantly, and the fact that there are a lot of socioeconomic problems is interesting. It's challenging. And I think, as you say, Sally, that can energise a creative community.
So reading through this issue, I couldn't help recalling comments, mostly positive, but not always, that Irish writers tend to be more restrained, even contained, than writers of other traditions. It's almost a cliche that the strand of Irish realism that goes back to Joyce's Dubliners and focuses on the small dramas of the everyday and attempts at communication, which often fail, and so on. I think that's just not true in this collection. It's full of very energized and open kinds and experimental forms of writing. I note you've talked about how you are drawn to unseemliness in language, the opposite of restraint and containment. And I think this is the last question I've got time to ask from the floor, so I'd be really interested to hear just briefly from all of you about your thoughts on restraint and kind of explosive creativity in language.
Yeah, there's that idea that the new wave of Irish writing, Sally's generation and my generation to a certain extent, are the first ones almost to do amazing things with language, which is really, they certainly do, people like Sally and Colm and Sarah Bown, maybe doing wonderful things with language, but they're not the first Irish writers to do that. And I think that, there has always been a very strong experimental strain in Irish writing, but for some reason I think that narrative of the spare and the restrained and the idea that the unspoken or what's not said is so much more powerful, did take over, did become an idea of what Irish fiction was, that it was terribly powerful because of holding back, and that which is absent in the narrative is really devastating because the author has had the restraint not to put it there. But it's just half the story. And anyway, I think it's also maybe a simplification of what that kind of restraint was about ever or always. So I think personally I've become less interested in the unsaid or in the power of the unspoken. I think that maybe it was an instinct or it was a habit that I had picked up as a younger writer, and you're constantly changing as a writer anyway. But I think I wanted, for example, with my second novel, to force myself to put so many words on the page that readers would be disgusted with them. To really go beyond what's seemly, and to try and represent consciousness and what the inside of a mind really looks like. And I think that a lot of the writing that we're seeing coming out of Ireland now is using language to show what the inside of a culture looks like, what the inside of a culture's mind looks like. And some of it is not restrained, and that's as it should be.
Colm, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have no interest really in realism at all. In other words, that the sentence you make has a sound, even if it's a silent sound for the reader who's reading it, the writer who's writing it. And that what I noticed happening is that that sound, it's not the job of that sentence to tell you that man went left and then turned right and took off his hat. That if that's there, it's a comic there-ness at all, for example, in Beckett. But if it's there, say, in John McGahern, it's often got something strange with it. Even a piece of punctuation that just gives something. And therefore, I think that goes right through. I would notice it, for example, you mentioned Colin Barrett several times. What I find in those stories of his, and he's a young writer. He's 20, isn't he?
It's like 30.
30, right? Well, that's very, very, very young. That I'm finding it's just a shift halfway through a sentence where something is no longer being described, but something is being evoked by a way in which a sentence has turned. And so that I think this goes right through the tradition, and I think it might be what Beckett meant when he was asked if he was English, and he said, "Au contraire." That I find something closer to song, closer to prayer, closer to the poem, in a prose sentence. But however, if you started doing this deliberately, I think the reader would leave the room screaming, and the book would be. And now, it just comes. It's just there. So that it's. And there is whether we like it or not. I mean, it's a big problem we're all facing, and I don't know what you young guys are going to do about it. It's very difficult to get domestic harmony into any Irish set of circumstances. I mean, from Long Day's Journey into Night to Tom Murphy's place to Brian Friel's place. I mean, just the theatre world. Then go the novels. Then go the short stories. If there's a wedding, say Claire Keegan's version of a wedding, the priest will have been having an affair. There'll be everything possible that could be happening will be happening, except happiness for the bride and bridegroom, and the next generation emerging very clearly from their happiness to be happy themselves. In other words, if you just think of, if we had Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy would be a landlord. First of all, we'd shoot him. then we'd burn his house. And then Elizabeth would be in a state of such rage that her nose would be up against your window looking in at you, and the glass of the window would, of course, be broken. And we would have started there. I mean, we just didn't have that wonderful tradition that the neighbouring island in our archipelago had, or that the French had with Balzac and Zola and Flaubert. We just didn't have that. So that all we keep making are these little ruined families. Like when I read your story, I said, "Oh wow, it's so great you're doing still." The only child, the fucked up father, and this is a party. What's going to happen at the party? Mayhem. Someone's not going to come. And you know what I'm talking about. The word, if they're refugees, like there will be the worst disaster will ensue. I tried in one novel to do this, like to have a party at the beginning of a novel in which everybody would enjoy. And then all the worst things happened afterwards. I just couldn't help myself. I didn't mean it. And we're sort of stuck with it. I don't know what's going to happen.
I'd like to throw the discussion over to the floor, and you can ask more questions about miserable Irish families if you like. Yeah, it's true. Emma McBride's new novel is about joy.
Yeah, no, I met Emma McBride, who's a wonderful writer. Her new novel is about joy, and I looked at her balefully. I imagine what you're going to do to the word joy, the very word joy, will immediately be undermined to such an extent it will change its dictionary.
Are there questions from the floor? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for a delightful event. Really, very. And please take this in the right way for anyone in the audience who feels that I'm going to say something very negative. I have a little needlepoint on my desk that a friend made for me when I was younger, and it said, "I survived Catholic school." So I went to 16 years of Catholic school, but I cannot separate from the reading of Irish writings without reflecting on the negativity that was brought up in my experience, and wondered if that is why there is some of the negativity that constantly comes back. Because a very dear friend of mine who's a writer, Robert Cranny, an Irish writer, he said, my book was really well received, but now I'll probably get cancer. So it was never this feeling of total joy and total, I deserve that, it was a good book, I wrote that, blah, blah, blah. There's always that fear that that's retribution will come because of the Catholic, you didn't deserve that, that's God's gift to you, and he's speaking through you or whatever. So
it's just, in case people at the back couldn't hear, it's a question about the relationship between the kind of negativity Colm has been talking about and a Catholic upbringing. Would anyone like to take that up?
Let me say first
Or
of
be
all that I
damned.
didn't have one, so I didn't have a Catholic upbringing, so I can rule myself out.
So your misery is unexplained.
No, I mean I'm pretty joyful. It's great.
answer that?
No,
Really? Okay.
Well, I think that maybe a lot of Irish writers write because they think they're going to be in trouble otherwise, which is an inheritance of a Catholic education, always feeling like you're going to get into terrible trouble.
If you don't, right?
Well, if you don't do any, just in general, on any given day, just feeling in trouble.
Yes, Catholic guilt.
I've heard of it, and I think that that inevitably must seep into the writing somehow. Putting your characters in trouble, causing trouble, writing out of a sense of, I don't know if it's writing out of a sense of guilt, but yeah, it permeates the work. I suppose when you grow up inside of it, it is maybe it's hard and maybe ill-advised to try and get a perspective on it.
I'm not sure the extent to which Catholicism has been a huge influence either on me personally or in my writing, and I wonder whether there's a kind of decay in the level of influence that the Catholic Church exercises in Ireland. Probably not as quick a level of decay as many of us might like to see, but I think maybe the Celtic Tiger sort of replaced the value system of the Catholic Church in a lot of ways with a kind of an economic neoliberal value system that sort of took over where the Catholic Church left off. And again, not that I'm saying it's left off completely, because it hasn't. I did go to Catholic school, but I'm not sure. I don't know that I grew up in the same Ireland that sort of felt very much under the thumb of the Church. I think that maybe there were competing value systems kind of toward the end of the 90s, and then as we moved into the 2000s, that sort of went along with, and didn't necessarily contradict, but were introduced along with the value systems of the Church. So I don't know exactly how to answer that question. I'm not sure.
Any other questions from the floor? Really? Yes, thank you.
Well, I'm wondering, just even listening to all of your stories this evening and your poem, they're all very, very different. And there's this incredible wealth of literature that comes from a small island, and nobody wants to generalize and just, lump everything into Irish literature, but if you had to, in some way, identify something about Ireland, this one country that is producing all of this talent, like, where would you start, I guess? Whether it's kind of the rural aspect that we talked about before, or I don't really know, but it's just, I guess one reason that I ask is, I kind of wonder, I'm Irish, and I live here now, but I wonder, why do other people care about Irish literature, really? Which I don't mean, I'm a huge champion. Something I wonder, and if we were to kind of bring that back to what it is about Ireland that produces all of this incredible creativity, I wonder what that would be.
Well, I suppose I would like to blame the Brits for this, to say that one of the extraordinary things you notice from sometime in the early 19th century is the extraordinary relationships that Irish writers had with London editors, and the extraordinary warm reception that Irish writers received from someone like Maria Edgeworth, writing in the early 19th century, right through the century, into the 20th century, and including now, that London, that the proximity to London, which is the great centre of publishing, and the fact that you're writing in the same language to some extent as they are, and the fact that southern England has a hugely educated and literate population, and they read books. They also have a long winter, as we do, and they read books, and they're absolutely fascinated by the outside world. They have been travelling, colonising in certain ways, but that's not entirely fair. For example, I think the reception, for example, of the contemporary Indian novel in London has been similar to this. And so I think that's very important in the same way as Barcelona became the place where South American writers came and found a home, and everything came out of their relationship to editors, people, writers like Garcia Marquez and Maria Vargas Llosa, that the way they then began to work and feel came out of that relationship to an editor in Barcelona. And I think each one of us probably has had that relationship, oddly enough, the easy relationship with London. the fact that London seems to like you, sometimes more than anybody else likes you. And I suppose the second thing arises from the whole idea, we don't have Rembrandt, we don't have Beethoven, paper is cheap, but also the only way you could be ensured of getting a job indoors, which was every family's dream for their child, to get a job indoors, was literacy. Literacy was this hugely important matter. And then out of the next step from literacy was publishing a book. And the number of ballads written, the number of figures from a small town who would write in the local paper, who would have a small literary talent, and then you'd watch somebody say the sort of encouragement or the feeling of importance a book might have in a place. And I think this has really been true about poetry in Northern Ireland. That the idea, and again I think it's an important issue with Catholicism, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, it's one way that hasn't mattered in Northern Ireland, that if you name the poets, and the way in which the poets have related to each other and to London and to Dublin, that whether they're Michael Longley, Derek Mahan, Seamus Heaney, Maeve McKeon, Kieran Carson, the older generation of yours, the actual religious divide has not been an issue, as much as they might argue about whether they preferred one poet to another, but that they were all welcomed in London, that they all had a relationship to Dublin, that they all knew each other, and that was an important, whatever, that somewhere or other, writing a new poem remains a very important thing to do, not only in the north but also in the south. A new poem could be shown around to people. I mean, like that new poem you have there. I mean, I will tell people there's a new poet. Have you heard of him? And people would say, "Oh my God, can I get this?" That this still matters. In the same way as a new singer would matter. In the same way as a new novel or story would matter. That somehow or other, that's still there. And it comes perhaps out of absence. No one's talking about a great new Rembrandt or a great new symphony, that arises from that.
Yes. I think this is the first time I've been liked by London in Granta, and I feel really happy about that. Sort of centripetal or centrifugal, I'm not sure which is the word. But I'm trying to catch your eye, the young woman who asked the question. But I don't want to do it to make you feel lonely. But I think, I don't want to say to be Irish is to have a genetic marker for. I feel it in reading this journal, and I love this and I hate this. I mean, there's a loneliness, I think, that is pervasive and wonderful and helpful in Irish writing, and I suppose it's Frank O'Connor's idea of the lonely voice of the submerged population. I think so many of us are accessing that in different ways, that sort of creates this landscape that perhaps you're thinking of.
And in fact, this had been a question that I had been going to ask, which was about the kind of education system, which is related, I suppose, to connects both of your points really. That many of you sitting here have written very kind of literate kinds of writing. You're thinking back through other writers, and that must partly be because you're trained to think through other writers. So I suppose part of the question has got, I think, is part of the answer has to do with the forms of literary education that happen from quite early on in Ireland. So it's not just that you end up being interested in what new poet has come out, because you've had to learn to be interested earlier than that. I don't know. Would you agree?
Can I just say something brief about that? I mean, when I was starting to buy books, about 1970, you wouldn't buy an Irish book under any circumstance. All that rain, Catholicism, all that dreariness, I just wouldn't dream of reading. And I'm throwing Joyce in, the whole lot of them. Portrait the Artist of the Young Man, I do. And I had all that. But Hemingway, and Jean-Paul Sartre, Kafka. In other words, that this business of globalization was for what's going on in economies now is for slow learners. I mean, we were doing it, and so I think reading was a way of finding the outside world as much as finding your own heritage.
Yeah, I would very much agree. I mean, I guess I would say two things, which, as I mentioned, I mean, I'm a student, and I mean, I have had, you know, on a very basic level, I'm very curious about language. I like it. I spend a lot of time, you know, like occasionally I'll encounter a word and think, I have no idea what that word is. I must find out, so I go and find out. I mean, I'm very, very curious, I guess, about stuff, as most people are. I think, like, I want to know how stuff works. But what you were saying about London and Ireland, I mean, I feel that for the US. I mean, as a student, I mean, I've benefited from the Fulbright program, so a lot of Fulbright scholars come to Ireland and tell us about the US. And, you know, I mean, that's the otherness for me. It's, I guess the US is a little larger than Ireland. But, you know, that they are doing something similar with the same language, but that's you know, that's my language. I thought I knew what that was, but I don't. And I mean, I feel as though I look west more than east, I guess, as far as looking for poetry in English goes.
I'm just getting a signal that we're out of time, so I would like you to please all join with me in thanking our fantastic